These meetings will never be the same without Howard Long, and I dedicate this talk to his memory. This year marks the 50th anniversary of the death of our 35th president, John Fitzgerald Kennedy. He is the youngest person ever elected president at age 43, and the only Catholic. JFK became president at the height of the Cold War. It began in 1947 with the Truman Doctrine containing the spread of communism and passage of the National Security Act, establishing the CIA, Department of Defense, the military's Joint Chiefs of Staff, and the National Security Council. The following year, the National Security Directive 10-2 created the doctrine of plausible deniability, which enabled the CIA to disclaim responsibility for committing crimes of state. Shortly after taking office, Kennedy was confronted with the Nixon CIA-planned Bay of Pigs invasion. Knowing that it would fail, but not telling JFK in order to get his approval, its planners banked on the new young president knuckling under and providing air support and sending U.S. troops to aid the Cuban exile-led invasion when it began to fail. Kennedy refused to do this, fired the CIA director Allen Dulles and his two chief deputies, and vowed, quote, to splinter the CIA into 1,000 pieces and scatter it to the wind. The Joint Chiefs of Staff then wanted to mount Operation Northwoods, a U.S. military invasion of Cuba justified by acts of terrorism performed by operatives of the military disguised as Cuban exiles, with loss of innocent American lives to make it look good. Kennedy angrily rejected this. Then came the Cuban Missile Crisis, which brought the world to the brink of nuclear war. The Joint Chiefs insisted that Kennedy let them bomb and invade Cuba. Air Force Chief of Staff Curtis LeMay even wanted to carpet bomb the Soviet Union with nuclear weapons. JFK enraged the military chiefs by promising that the U.S. would never invade Cuba, would remove its nuclear weapons from Turkey along the Russian border if Khrushchev could remove the missiles in Cuba, which he did, ending the crisis. Then there was the American University commencement address promoting nuclear disarmament and coexistence with the communists.
What kind of a peace do I mean, and what kind of a peace do we seek? Not a Pax Americana, enforced on the world by American weapons of war. Not the peace of the grave or the security of the slave. I am talking about genuine peace, the kind of peace that makes life on earth worth living, the kind that enables men and nations to grow and to hope and build a better life for their children. Not merely peace for Americans, but peace for all men and women. Not merely peace in our time, but peace in all time.
He also said in this speech, quote, "Let us re-examine our attitude toward the Soviet Union. If we cannot now end our differences, at least we can help make the world safe for diversity. For in the final analysis, our most basic common link is that we all inhabit this small planet. We all breathe the same air. We are all mortal." Overcoming initial Senate opposition, he got a nuclear test ban treaty with the Russians passed on September 24th. Then what some considered to be the last straw was his National Security Action Memorandum 263, where Kennedy announced his intention to pull all U.S. troops out of Vietnam by 1965, beginning with 1,000 coming out in December. At the time, there were 16,000 troops in Vietnam and 95 deaths. President Kennedy issued this memorandum on October 11th. 6 weeks later, he was killed. Everyone over the age of 60, and many over the age of 55, who were in grade school at the time, remember where they were and what they were doing when they heard what happened to President Kennedy on November 22nd, 1963. I was a third-year medical student finishing lunch in the school's dining hall when a student ran in and yelled, "President Kennedy has been shot." This is a freeze-frame film taken by a bystander, Abraham Zapruder, the moment Kennedy was shot through the head and killed, with his wife Jacqueline reaching out over the trunk of the limo for a piece of his skull blown out by the bullet, and Secret Service agent Clint Hill climbing up into the limo. The FBI immediately determined that an assassin named Oswald killed President Kennedy, firing 3 bullets from a window in the Texas School Book Depository. First, it was 3 bullets. Then a day later, when it was learned that one missed and grazed a bystander, it was 2 bullets that killed the president, that hit the president. A week later, President Lyndon Johnson formed the 7-member Warren Commission, which endorsed the FBI's conclusion that Lee Oswald did it alone and that no one else planned or participated in the attack. The commission, however, had to explain how only 2 bullets caused all the damage done to JFK and to Governor Connally sitting in the limo in front of him. 1 bullet went through Kennedy's head, killing him. The other one, according to the commission's single bullet theory, went in Kennedy's back and out his neck, in and out of Connally's chest, in and out of his wrist, and then into his thigh, landing and staying there. I began my study of the Kennedy assassination in 1967 when I read Josiah Thompson's book, 6 Seconds in Dallas, a micro-study of the Kennedy assassination. And at this point, 50 years after his death, I may be the only person still alive who knew both President Kennedy's military physician, Admiral Burkley, and his family, and the surgeon in Texas who performed a tracheotomy on Kennedy after he was shot, Dr. Malcolm Perry. When I was a teenager, my family lived next door to Dr. Burkley and his family in a duplex in the Newport Naval Hospital compound, which housed the chief of medicine, Dr. Burkley, and the chief of surgery, my dad, who was a career Navy surgeon. Dr. Burkley's son, George W., was my age, and we became friends. Once, we sailed up Narragansett Bay in his small snipe sailboat and camped out on an uninhabited island. But our adventure was cut short the next morning when a Navy launch arrived to tow us back home, sent by our fathers because a hurricane warning had been issued. Well, this is a Google Earth picture of the Newport Naval Hospital, and that duplex is still there. Dr. Perry moved from Texas to the University of Washington in 1974, and we worked together for several years. The arrow shows where our offices were located next to each other in the medical center. When Kennedy was shot, he was taken to Parkland Memorial Hospital. Dr. Tom Shires was the chief of surgery there, but he was in Galveston, 300 miles away at a surgery meeting when the assassination occurred. He immediately flew back to Dallas and operated on Governor Connally. And 2 days later, he and Dr. Perry operated on Oswald after Jack Ruby shot him, but he died on the table because the bullet went through his aorta and vena cava and he bled to death on the operating table. Dr. Shires moved to Seattle in 1974 to become chair of surgery at the University of Washington. And he brought several Parkland surgeons with him, which included Dr. Perry and Dr. Carrico. Dr. Jim Carrico was the first doctor to see Kennedy when he was brought to the hospital. He inserted the tube into his trachea through his mouth, but when that didn't work, then Dr. Perry performed a tracheotomy. I was the last UW surgeon that Dr. Shires hired before he moved to Cornell. Dr. Perry left and joined Dr. Shires in 1978. Dr. Carrico stayed on and became chair of the UW Department of Surgery in 1983 and held that position until 1990. Dr. Perry was the first physician to speak publicly about the president's injuries in a televised news conference an hour after his death. A newsman asked him, "Where was the entrance wound?" Dr. Perry informed the American public and the world that, quote, "There was an entrance wound in the neck. The bullet appeared to be coming at him," which he stated 3 times at the news conference. This did not sit well with the Warren Commission. The bullet hole in Kennedy's neck had to be an exit wound if Oswald was the assassin. Presented with the single bullet theory, when testifying before the commission, several months later, Dr. Perry obligingly changed his view of the matter and said that the bullet wound he observed in the neck was, quote, "certainly would be consistent with an exit wound." Dr. Burkley filled out Kennedy's death certificate. In the summary of facts relating to death, he states, quote, "A second wound occurred in the posterior back about the level of the third thoracic vertebra. The third thoracic vertebra, which is readily palpable, is 5.5 inches below the neck." This also did not sit well with the Warren Commission. The bullet wound in Kennedy's neck and back had to be at a much higher location in order for it to come out his neck, especially when shot from a 6th-floor building behind him. The Warren Commission dealt with this by completely ignoring Kennedy's death certificate and not having Dr. Burkley testify. The death certificate is not in the Warren report or its 26 volumes of hearings and exhibits, but in the 17,816 pages of hearing exhibits, you will find such things as a certificate of smallpox vaccination for Oswald's daughter June, Commission Exhibit 73A, Jack Ruby's income tax returns, but not Oswald's tax returns, said to be withheld for, quote, national security. That was CE 713 to 19. And then a fragment, I love this one, then a fragment of an aria from Tchaikovsky's opera, The Queen of Spades, CE 53. And the condition of Marina Oswald's teeth, CE 1403. Right after the assassination, Malcolm Kilduff, acting White House press secretary, told reporters, quote, "Dr. Burkley told me it is a simple matter of a bullet right through the head," and asked, "Can you say where the bullet entered his head?" He replies, "It is my understanding that it entered the temple, the right temple." The Warren Report was published on September 27, 1964, saying Oswald was the lone assassin. Books critiquing the Warren Report soon followed. The first 5 books of many to come in 1965 were, in 65, Whitewash by Harold Weisberg. In 1966, Rushed to Judgment by Mark Lane. The Second Oswald by Richard Popkin. And in 1967, Accessories After the Fact by Sylvia Mayer. And then 6 Seconds in Dallas. Sylvia Mayer, also in pre-computer 1966, put together and published a book titled Subject Index to the Warren Report and Hearings and Exhibits, which is something the Commission chose not to do. Since then, a great deal has been learned and much written about the Kennedy assassination. Dr. Perry publicly changed his view of the neck wound after a Secret Service agent came to Dallas, threatened him, and coerced him to testify that it was an exit wound. In 1970, this agent, Elmer Moore, confessed to a friend that he had acted, quote, on orders from Washington. He regretted that he had, quote, badgered Dr. Perry into making a flat statement that there was no entry wound in the neck. So ordered, he said, I did everything I was told. We all did everything we were told, or we'd get our heads cut off. The friend told this to, appropriately enough, a University of Washington graduate student named Jim Gockenauer. 13 years later, Dr. Perry and I operated together on a patient with a thoracoabdominal aneurysm, where I removed the thoracic chest part of the aneurysm and Dr. Perry the abdominal part. When our residents were closing the incision, Malcolm and I sat together alone in the surgeon's lounge drinking coffee. Dr. Perry always refused to discuss the Kennedy assassination, but that night, after we had been operating together for many hours on a complex case, I once again asked him about it. This time, Dr. Perry said that the bullet wound in Kennedy's neck was, in fact, unquestionably an entrance wound. A year later, to the House Select Committee on Assassinations, supporting the government's one bullet, two victim official truth, he reaffirmed publicly that it was an exit wound, explaining that the wound was so small that he had mistaken it for an entrance wound. But then again in 1986, Dr. Perry told another physician, a Dr. Robert Artwall, that it was an entrance wound. Then Oliver Stone's movie, JFK, came out in December 1991, which makes a mockery of the single bullet theory. And in April 1992, Dr. Charles Crenshaw's book, JFK, Conspiracy of Silence, was published, where he criticizes his colleagues at Parkland Hospital for not speaking out about the true facts of Kennedy's bullet wounds and the falsified autopsy. In response, the editor of the Journal of the American Medical Association had a journalist write an article vindicating the autopsy report and the single bullet theory. It was published in JAMA in May 1992. Dr. Perry and Dr. Carrico and two other doctors involved in Kennedy's care at Parkland, shown in this photo, were interviewed along with two of the three pathologists who performed the autopsy. Dr. Perry, and Drs. Perry and Carrico said that Dr. Crenshaw didn't know what he was talking about, and they gave their unqualified endorsement to the autopsy findings. Dr. Crenshaw was one of the doctors attending Kennedy at Parkland. He sued and won a substantial settlement from JAMA. The journalist who wrote the article was sacked, and not long thereafter, the editor of the journal, Dr. George Lundberg, resigned. Sadly, in order to keep in good standing with the state and avoid committing an Orwellian thought crime, both Dr. Perry and Dr. Carrico, two leading American surgeons who were colleagues of mine at the University of Washington, disavowed their initial testimony and perjured themselves. Dr. Burkley also struggled with the truth on this. He knew what happened to Kennedy. He was the only physician with him at Parkland Hospital on the flight back on Air Force One, at the autopsy done by military physicians at the National Naval Medical Center in Bethesda, Maryland. And after the autopsy, Dr. Burkley took possession of Kennedy's brain, what was left of it. To ensure his silence, President Johnson made him his personal physician and promoted him from the rank of Rear Admiral to Vice Admiral. In 1967, when asked if he agreed with the Warren Commission on how many bullets struck Kennedy, he replies, quote, "I would not care to be quoted on that." But in 1977, he tells his lawyer, William Illig, to contact Richard Sprague, chief counsel of the House Select Committee on Assassinations, and say that he would explain to him why there must have been more than one shooter. But when Sprague was ousted and the HSCA went into a cover-up mode, this did not happen. In 1978, he signs an incorrect and untruthful affidavit for the HSCA, which says that on Air Force One to Bethesda, the Dallas casket was constantly observed and not opened or disturbed. But then in 1982, he tells researcher Henry Hurt that JFK was a target of a conspiracy. In 1983, he admits to another researcher that JFK had a large wound in the back of his head that had all the appearance of an exit wound. Then in 1997, his daughter, Nancy Denley, the executor of his estate, at first agrees to release her father's attorney-client file on JFK's death to the Assassination Records Review Board. But then she suddenly changes her mind, reneges, and refuses to sign a waiver of confidentiality required to review the files. I contacted Dr. Burkley's son, George W., recently. He's a retired Marine Corps pilot, now living in Hawaii. This is him on his boat. All he was willing to say was, Dad never voiced much of an opinion about a conspiracy, but frequently questioned why the Warren Commission never asked him to testify. Dad was a very close hold when it came to his professional life. Dr. Burkley was an honorable man who fell prey to the cover-up. The 17th century British philosopher Francis Bacon, whose writings were instrumental in the development of the scientific method, said that truth is the daughter of time, not of authority. The JFK assassination story over the last half-century illustrates well this maxim. During the first 12 years following Kennedy's death, the government, with its Clark Panel and Rockefeller Commission, and the government-controlled media, holds fast to the Oswald was the sole assassin scenario, despite withering critiques by assassination researchers and Jim Garrison's thwarted effort to bring the truth to light with the Clay Shaw trial in New Orleans in 1969. Then in 1975, for the first time, ABC shows the Zapruder film, which starkly challenges the Oswald acted alone scenario. As a result, the House Select Committee on Assassinations holds hearings. It winds up still blaming Oswald, but concludes there was a second shooter who missed, thus indicating a conspiracy which was not investigated. Next is Oliver Stone's film JFK, a major turning point in the pursuit of truth in this case. It produces a firestorm of public outcry, prodding Congress to pass the JFK Records Act, releasing several million sealed records, and create the Assassination Records Review Board to review them. And following 40 years of work by assassination researchers, 5 books published in the last 10 years prove beyond a reasonable doubt what happened. They are The Breach of Trust, How the Warren Commission Failed the Nation and Why, by Gerald McKnight. He shows that the Commission's predetermined conclusion and unspoken mandate was to quell rumors of conspiracy and convince the public that the FBI was right and Oswald, with regard to Oswald. And accordingly, the Commission suppressed evidence of a fatal wound from the front. Then inside the Assassination Records Review Board, the U.S. government's final attempt to reconcile the conflicting medical evidence in the assassination of JFK by Douglas Horne. Harvey and Lee How the CIA Framed Oswald by John Armstrong. Armstrong's groundbreaking, extensive research confirms that the CIA created and directed two Oswalds, and that the American-born Oswald helped the agency set up his Russian double as the patsy. A Farewell to Arms, Jim Garrison, JFK's Assassination, and the Case That Should Have Changed History by Joan Mellon. Jim Garrison is our modern-day Paul Revere, and he presciently warned that one disaster that we need to prepare for is, quote, fascism will come to America in the name of national security. And the fifth one is JFK and the Unspeakable, Why He Died and Why It Matters, by James Douglas. If you read one book on the JFK assassination, I recommend that you read that one, JFK and the Unspeakable, Why He Died and Why It Matters. In Inside the ARRB, Doug Horn uses the term evidentiary landscape for the various lines of evidence in the case. The medical evidence consists of witnesses in the motorcade at Parkland Hospital at the autopsy, the death certificate, Kennedy's clothes, the autopsy, and movies and photos of the act. Rather than a landscape, however, these lines of evidence make up a factual matrix. And in this matrix, like in a court of law, the conflicting evidence is weighed and cross-examined for its probative value. Witnesses in the Kennedy motorcade provide strong evidence that a bullet shot from the front blew out a hole in the back of his head. Clint Hill wrote in his report, quote, I noticed a portion of the president's head was missing. Part of his brain was gone. The two motorcycle policemen riding behind Kennedy were splattered with his blood and brain. Jacqueline Kennedy told the Warren Commission and biographer Theodore White that she could see a piece of his skull coming off the back of his head. White House photographer Joe O'Donnell showed Jackie the Zapruder film privately a few weeks after the assassination. When he asked her why she tried to, quote, escape from the limo, she said she was not trying to escape, but rather was trying to pick up the pieces of the president's head from the top of the trunk of the car. This is a list of the medical personnel involved in Kennedy's care at Parkland Hospital. Of interest, Nurse Audrey Bell, who worked closely with Dr. Perry, told the ARRB that he complained to her Saturday morning, November 23rd, that people from Bethesda had been bothering him on the phone all night long, trying to get him to change his opinion about having seen an entry wound, to having instead be an exit wound in Kennedy's neck. Virtually all the doctors and nurses at Parkland confirmed that Jack Kennedy's head was blown out, as shown in this table in James Fetzer's book, Murder in Dealey Plaza. Dr. Carrico, in his treatment report, wrote that, as you see, he agreed there was a wound of entrance in the neck and that there was a big hole in the back of the head. These are some of the Bethesda autopsy witnesses who also demonstrate a large exit wound observed in the back of the president's head. And the FBI released a list of 18 Bethesda morgue autopsy witnesses in 1966. In 1979, the House Select Committee on Assassinations listed 36 such witnesses in its report, who researchers started interviewing. The HSCA sequestered and sealed the testimony of the witnesses that have a red asterisk next to their name for 50 years until 2026 because it contradicted the shot from behind scenario. But instead, the movie JFK and subsequent JFK Records Act got them released early. Then in 2009, Doug Horn in Inside the ARB added 3 more important witnesses: General Curtis LeMay, U.S. Air Force Chief of Staff, photographer Robert Knudsen, and Sergeant Roger Boyajian, the NCO in charge of the Bethesda Morgue security detail. The testimony of 3 witnesses I've highlighted in this list is telling. Lieutenant Richard Lipsey said the autopsy pathologist dutifully concluded and wrote that JFK was shot 3 times from behind. But a draft showing this had to be trashed and burned. It was burned when it was learned a day later that one of the shots had missed. Captain Robert Canada, the commanding officer of Bethesda Naval Hospital, confirmed that JFK had a large, evulsed, blown-out wound in the back of his head. But more importantly, Captain Canada told a researcher that his cohort, commanding officer of the U.S. Naval Medical School at Bethesda, had ordered one of the autopsy pathologists to rewrite the autopsy report so it would fit the 2-bullet scenario. He would reveal this only on one condition: the researcher must promise not to disclose it until 25 years after his death. Captain Canada died in 1981. The researcher, Michael Kurtz, waited as promised and did not report Captain Canada's testimony until 2006 in his book, The JFK Assassination Debates, published that year. And then there's Sergeant Roger Boyajian's report. That is the smoking gun of the medical evidence. He writes in his report that the president's body arrived at the morgue loading dock at 6:35 p.m., encased in a body bag in a cheap aluminum shipping casket, transported in a black hearse with several men in blue suits that were federal officials, before the ornamental bronze casket into which the body had been placed in Dallas arrived with Jackie and Robert Kennedy in an Andrews Air Force Base motorcade. This early arrival of the body is corroborated by a half a dozen other military and funeral home witnesses. Most importantly, this testimony establishes the fact that the chain of custody of the body was broken when it left Dallas, which alone invalidates the autopsy as a medical legal document. Dr. Perry testified that the incision he made in Kennedy's neck for the tracheotomy was 2 to 3 centimeters, about an inch wide. Other medical personnel at Parkland, Dr. Crenshaw, Nurse Audrey Bell, have testified that Dr. Perry made a small incision, not one much wider than the tube that the surgeon inserts into the trachea. The autopsy photograph instead shows a 3-inch wide gash. Nurse Audrey Bell, upon seeing this photograph, said, quote, "Looks like somebody has enlarged it. You don't make trachs that big, not if you've got as much experience as Perry has." I operated with Dr. Perry. We performed surgery together. He was a careful and meticulous surgeon. He never would have made an incision for a tracheotomy that looks like that in that autopsy photograph, be it on the President of the United States or on a drug addict. Along with the interrupted chain of custody of his body, this photograph proves beyond a reasonable doubt that Kennedy's corpse has been tampered with. One of the autopsy pathologists, Lieutenant Commander Thornton Boswell, made a diagram of the wounds and scars he observed on the body. It places the bullet wound in the back at the same level, T3, as in the death certificate. Dr. Burkley signed it and wrote "verified" above his signature. The way the Warren Commission dealt with this surviving piece of evidence demonstrates the chicanery it practiced in its investigation of the assassination. The Commission published Boswell's diagram as Commission Exhibit 397, but Admiral Burkley's signature validating it has been erased. It is gone. And like with Dr. Perry, when Dr. Boswell came before the commission, he also had an accommodating change of mind and testified that he had drawn the bullet hole in the back too low, saying now that it was actually considerably higher than that, high enough to lend credence to the single bullet theory. And with his signature not there, the commission didn't have to question Dr. Burkley about it. Even if the bullet had entered Kennedy's body higher up at neck level, it still could not have exited through the front of his neck unscathed. As the radiologist Dr. David Mantic has shown, this cross-sectional CT scan demonstrates that it would have hit the hard transverse process of a cervical vertebra and been deflected and deformed, unlike the one found on the stretcher that was pristine and virtually intact. This single piece of evidence alone would have invalidated the Warren Commission's single bullet theory. But CT scans were not invented yet and didn't start being used until 1974. The death certificate, the autopsy descriptive sheet, the bullet holes in Kennedy's clothes, alone, without the evidence of the CT scan, prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the single bullet theory is false. Along with the other exculpatory evidence, the jury would have declared Lee Harvey Oswald innocent and acquitted him from the charge of assassinating the president. Oswald didn't do it, so who did? After the missile crisis confronting nuclear Armageddon and emboldened by the hope for peace, President Kennedy ran afoul of the national security state, what President Eisenhower called the military-industrial complex, whose ruling assumptions are interwoven with preparing for and waging war. This president threatened its interests by committing the cardinal sin of not trying to win the Cold War, but instead to seek peace with Nikita Khrushchev and Fidel Castro, the top enemies of the state. Power brokers in the CIA and military decided in 1963 that John F. Kennedy was a threat to national security, and that he had to go and be replaced with a president who would do their bidding, escalate the war in Vietnam, and stop talking to Khrushchev and Castro. The CIA killed President Kennedy in league with the powers that be in the national security state, abetted by the FBI and the Secret Service. Other suspects, the mafia, KGB, Cuban exiles, Castro, can be quickly dismissed because there is no way that any of them could have controlled the events at the U.S. military hospital in Bethesda on how the autopsy was done and falsified. This is a truth that government officials, media pundits wanting to protect and further their careers, and many trusting, patriotic Americans do not want to face. Next was Robert Kennedy. When JFK's brother announced he was entering the race to be elected president in 1968, Arthur Schlesinger asked Jackie Kennedy what she thought about that. She said, "You know what I think will happen? Same thing that happened to Jack." This is a video clip of the victory speech he gave after winning the California primary, which made him the Democratic nominee and thus, in all probability, the next president of the United States.
The importance of what has happened here in the state of California, what has happened in South Dakota, what happened in New Hampshire, what happened across the rest of this country. The country wants to move in a different direction. We want to deal with our own problems within our own country, and we want peace in Vietnam.
In addition to following a peace-seeking foreign policy path like his brother, he told people that as president he would reopen the Warren Commission to investigate his brother's death. Minutes later, Bobby Kennedy was shot walking through the hotel to a press conference. The purported lone assassin in this case was Sirhan standing several feet in front of him, firing a .22 caliber pistol. The autopsy, however, confirmed that a larger caliber bullet, most likely a .32 or .38 caliber, fired in the back of Kennedy's head is what killed him. Nitrite deposits and powder burns show that the pistol delivering the fatal shot was placed right next to the back of the head, 1 inch away. JFK was killed from the front, not behind where Oswald was. RFK was killed from behind, not the front where Sirhan was. After Robert Kennedy was killed, Jacqueline Kennedy is reported to have said, "If they're killing Kennedys, then my children are targets." In 1999, JFK Jr. decided to enter the Democratic primaries in the race to be elected president in 2000, which he most likely would have won. But it was not to be. He died on July 16, 1999, when his Piper Saratoga plane that he was flying to Martha's Vineyard crashed shortly before landing. His wife, Carolyn, and her sister, Lauren Bassett, were with him on the flight and perished also. Along with his wife and sister-in-law, there is evidence that an instructor also accompanied JFK Jr. on the flight. An instructor had been with him on all previous 8 flights, 8 times he had flown this newly purchased aircraft. Furthermore, he had a broken ankle, just had the cast taken off and was on crutches. Not something conducive to flying an airplane by yourself. And 3 witnesses testified that JFK Jr. told them that he was taking an instructor on the flight. Kennedy communicated with Martha's Vineyard Airport control tower at 9:39 p.m. on his final approach to the airport, 5 miles and 14 minutes away, when the plane suddenly plummeted straight down into the ocean from an altitude of 2,500 feet. Witness saw a bright flash and a small bomb placed on the aircraft that exploded in midair may have caused the crash. The FAA had a radar track, which we see here, that it did not release for 8 hours. And it suppressed the fact that he had radioed the airport's control tower shortly before landing and was not far offshore from the Vineyard when it crashed. Plus, the FAA said that no flight plan had been filed for the flight, which is something John Kennedy Jr. had always done unfailingly on his previous flights. The plane was officially located and retrieved 15 hours after the crash, after a bag with Lauren's identification on it had washed ashore. Several important things were missing, notably the flight log listing persons on board the aircraft. The blue duffel bag, where he always kept the flight log, however, was retrieved intact. The emergency beacon that all planes must carry was missing. The battery for the cockpit voice recorder was gone, leaving the voice recorder blank. The bodies of John, Carolyn, and Lauren strapped in their seats were retrieved, but the co-pilot seat containing the body of the flight instructor was missing. The media reported that the crash occurred because JFK was a, quote, reckless pilot who wanted to, quote, do it alone without a flight instructor. After its initial reportage that night and the next day, the media then ignored both the Coast Guard official, Todd Bergen, who documented that there was communication between Kennedy's plane and Martha's Vineyard at 9:39 p.m., and the witness who reported seeing a white flash indicating an explosion on the plane may have occurred. The National Transportation Safety Board, in its official analysis of the crash, also suppressed this key testimony. With the 50th anniversary of John Kennedy Sr.'s death coming up in November, people in Dealey Plaza have been seen wearing T-shirts that say, "Oswald acted alone." The education Americans receive has reduced them to dutifully wearing T-shirts like this. As H.L. Mencken put it, the aim of public education is not to spread enlightenment at all. It is simply to reduce as many individuals as possible to the same level, to a breed of standard citizenry, to put down dissent and originality. For such people, it should say, the state reigns and tells us what is true. Or even better, George Orwell was right, 1984. Jim Garrison put it best. He said, Americans are entering a new Orwellian world where the citizen exists for the state and where raw power justifies any and every immoral act. In such a world, to think and say that Oswald is innocent is a thought crime. Americans increasingly practice what Orwell terms crime stop, the faculty of stopping short at the threshold of any dangerous thought. It includes the power of not grasping analogies, of failing to perceive logical errors, of misunderstanding the simplest arguments if they're inimical to INSOC, English socialism, and of being bored or repelled by any train of thought which is capable of leading in a heretical direction. Crime Stop fosters protective stupidity. Indeed, believing Oswald did it alone, official truth, is equivalent to saying 2 + 2 = 5. Like with Howard Long, we may not live to see the truth of the Kennedy assassinations win out, but it will. For truth is a daughter of time, not of authority. It has taken more than 500 years for the truth to be realized that Richard III didn't kill his nephews. One hopes that the truth on the Kennedy assassinations comes sooner. Thank you for the opportunity to talk to you about this.